A little German shepherd keeps following Officer Claire Bennett for help, but what she discovers will leave you speechless. On a rain-soaked evening after her shift, this tiny pup appears out of nowhere, trailing her patrol car through empty streets with desperate, pleading eyes. Claire thinks it's just lost, maybe slipped from someone's yard. She stops, coaxes the shivering pup into her car, wrapping it in her jacket. But then something extraordinary happens. The pup becomes frantic, pawing at the window, whining, forcing her down a dark, deserted road she's never traveled. At an abandoned farmhouse, Claire discovers something that stops her breath. Faint cries echoing from within the shadows. This little shepherd isn't lost. It's leading her somewhere urgent, somewhere life and death. When she realizes the truth behind those pleading eyes, she bursts into tears. What could be so desperate that a tiny pup would risk everything? What's waiting in that abandoned house that will change both their lives forever? The rain drummed against the windshield of Officer Claire Bennett's patrol car as she finished the last of her paperwork. Another double shift was finally ending, and the empty streets glistened under the dim glow of streetlights. She rubbed her tired eyes and started the engine, ready to head back to the station. But as she pulled away from the curb, something caught her attention in the rearview mirror. A small, dark shape was moving between the shadows, keeping pace with her slow-moving vehicle. Claire squinted through the rain-streaked glass and saw it clearly now. A tiny German shepherd puppy, soaked to the bone, trotting determinedly behind her car. Its eyes, even at this distance, seemed to be locked on hers. She drove a bit faster, thinking it would give up and find shelter. But the little creature continued to follow, block after block, never falling behind, never looking away. Claire couldn't ignore it any longer. This wasn't coincidence. This puppy was deliberately following her. She pulled over to the curb and turned off the engine, watching as the small figure froze under a flickering streetlight. Rain pelted its matted fur, but it stood perfectly still, staring straight at her with an intensity that made her heart skip. There was something almost human in those dark eyes, something desperate and pleading. Against every protocol she'd been taught, Claire opened her car door and stepped into the rain. The cold immediately soaked through her uniform, but she ignored it, crouching low and extending her hand toward the shivering animal. "Come here, little one," she called softly, her voice barely audible over the steady downpour. The puppy hesitated for a moment, then slowly, cautiously, began to approach her outstretched fingers. As the puppy drew closer, Claire could see how young it was, probably no more than a few months old. Its fur was dirty and tangled, and when she gently checked around its neck, there was no collar, no tags, nothing to indicate where it belonged. The little creature trembled violently, whether from cold or fear, she couldn't tell. Claire's heart went out to it immediately. She knew she should call animal control and let them handle the situation. But something about this puppy's behavior struck her as extraordinary. It hadn't approached her randomly. It had been following her with purpose. She made a decision that surprised even herself. Pulling off her patrol jacket, she wrapped the soaked animal in its warmth and carefully lifted it into the back seat of her car. The moment she closed the door, the puppy's behavior changed dramatically. It immediately began pawing at the window, whining in a specific direction down the dark road ahead. Claire turned on the heater and looked back at her unexpected passenger. The rain was coming down even harder now, and visibility was getting worse by the minute. She should head straight to the station, file a report about the stray animal, and let the proper authorities handle it. But the puppy's whining grew more insistent, and it was clearly trying to direct her attention to something. Against her better judgment, and definitely against protocol, Claire found herself turning the wheel in the direction the animal was indicating. The well-lit streets of town gave way to darker, rural roads she rarely patrolled. The puppy remained standing on the back seat, pressing its nose against the window, occasionally letting out small, urgent barks. Its eyes never stopped scanning the darkness ahead, as if searching for something critically important. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that this little creature was trying to lead her somewhere specific, somewhere urgent. The headlights of Claire's patrol car cut through the darkness as they reached the end of a muddy, unpaved driveway. There, silhouetted against the stormy sky, stood an old farmhouse that had clearly been abandoned for years. Paint peeled from its weathered siding, several windows were boarded up, and the front porch sagged dangerously to one side. Claire parked the car and stepped out into the ankle-deep mud, her boots making sucking sounds with each step. The rain immediately soaked through her uniform again, but she barely noticed. The puppy had bolted from the car the moment she opened the door and was now standing on the rickety porch, barking sharply toward the front entrance. The sound was different now, more urgent, more desperate. The air around the old house was thick with the scent of damp wood, mildew, and something else she couldn't quite identify. But underneath the sound of rain, Claire could swear she heard something else. Faint, weak whimpering coming from inside the abandoned structure. Claire pulled out her flashlight and approached the farmhouse cautiously, her hand instinctively moving toward her service weapon. The front door was warped and partially off its hinges, and when she pushed it open, it creaked loudly in protest. Her flashlight beams swept across the interior, revealing a scene of complete abandonment. Broken furniture was scattered across the floor, ceiling beams had collapsed in several places, and everything was covered in a thick layer of dust and debris. But in the far corner, huddled together under a broken wooden chair, her light illuminated something that made her gasp. 3 tiny puppies, even smaller than the one that had led her here, were pressed together in a pathetic heap. They were soaked from rain that had leaked through the damaged roof, painfully thin and barely moving. The German Shepherd puppy that had brought her here immediately ran to them, licking their faces and whining softly. Claire knelt down, her heart breaking at the sight. These babies were dying, and without immediate help, they wouldn't survive another night in this cold, wet place. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Claire immediately reached for her radio to call for animal rescue, but when she tried to transmit, all she got was static. The storm had knocked out communication in this remote area, and when she checked her phone, the screen showed no service. She was completely cut off from any help, and these 4 tiny lives were depending entirely on her. The reality of the situation hit her like a physical blow. She was their only chance. The 3 puppies under the chair were in critical condition, hypothermic, and severely dehydrated. They might not survive another hour in these conditions, let alone the time it would take for her to drive back to town and return with proper help. Claire made another decision that went against every regulation in her training manual. She carefully lifted each of the nearly unconscious puppies and wrapped them in her patrol jacket along with their protective sibling. The little German Shepherd seemed to understand what was happening and stayed close, as if supervising her efforts to save its family. Getting the 4 puppies safely to the car was only the beginning of Claire's challenge. The drive back to town would normally take 30 minutes, but in this weather, on these rural roads, it could take much longer. She placed the makeshift bundle of puppies on the back seat and started driving as carefully as she could manage. The rain was relentless, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. She spoke softly to the animals as she drove, hoping her voice would provide some comfort. "It's going to be okay," she murmured, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. "We're going to get you help." As she navigated the winding country roads, memories began flooding back. Memories of another rainy night many years ago when she was just 7 years old. She had been trapped in her bedroom when their house caught fire, scared and alone, until a stranger had appeared at her window and carried her to safety. That night had shaped her entire life, instilling in her a deep belief that protecting others was life's highest calling. Claire's heart sank when she saw the flashing hazard lights ahead. The main road back to town was completely flooded, with water rushing across the asphalt in a swift current that would be impossible to drive through. She stopped the car and stared at the obstacle before her. The alternative route would add more than an hour to their journey, and she wasn't sure the weakest puppies could survive that long. They needed medical attention now, not in an hour and a half. The little German Shepherd seemed to sense her distress and whined softly from the back seat. Claire looked back at the bundle of barely moving fur and made what might have been the most dangerous decision of her career. She would have to carry all 4 puppies across the flooded road on foot. The current looked strong, and the water was obviously deep in the middle, but it was their only chance. She turned off the engine and took several deep breaths, trying to steady her nerves. Then she carefully lifted the smallest puppy and tucked it inside her uniform shirt, zipping her jacket around it. The other 3, including the brave little shepherd, went into a plastic crate she kept in her trunk for evidence storage. The shock of the cold water nearly took Claire's breath away as she stepped into the flooded road. The current was stronger than she had anticipated, and within just a few steps, the water was above her knees and rising. Mud sucked at her boots with each step, making progress slow and treacherous. The plastic crate with 3 puppies felt increasingly heavy in her arms, and the little one, pressed against her chest, barely stirred. She focused on each step, ignoring the cold that was seeping through her clothes and into her bones. The puppies seemed to sense the danger because they remained remarkably still, as if they understood that any movement might spell disaster for all of them. Halfway across, Claire's foot slipped on the muddy bottom, and for a terrifying moment, she thought she was going to fall. The current pulled hard at her legs, and the crate tilted dangerously in her grip. But somehow, she managed to catch herself on a partially submerged log, using it to steady herself before continuing forward. Lightning suddenly illuminated the flooded road, and Claire realized with horror that she was still less than halfway across. The storm seemed to be intensifying, and the water level was definitely rising. She adjusted her grip on the crate and continued speaking softly to the puppies, as much to keep herself calm as to comfort them. "Almost there," she whispered, though her voice was shaking with cold and exhaustion. "Just a little further." Each step was a monumental effort now, and her muscles were beginning to cramp from the cold water and the strain of carrying the animals while fighting the current. The little puppy inside her jacket stirred slightly, and she took that as a good sign. At least it was still alive. The thought of losing any of these innocent creatures after coming this far was unbearable. She pushed forward with renewed determination, drawing strength from the trust they had placed in her. The far bank seemed impossibly distant, but she refused to give up. These babies needed her, and she would not let them down. A large branch came floating down the current and slammed into Claire's leg just as she was finding her rhythm. The impact nearly knocked the crate from her hands, and she stumbled, water splashing up and soaking the already frightened animals. But somehow, she managed to keep her grip and continue forward. The branch had hit her hard, and she could feel a sharp pain shooting up her thigh, but she couldn't stop to assess the damage. Every second in this freezing water was potentially life-threatening for the puppies. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, her boots found solid ground on the far side of the flood. She stumbled up the muddy embankment, completely exhausted, her legs shaking from cold and fatigue. Setting the crate down carefully, she unzipped her jacket to check on the puppy she had been carrying against her chest. It was still breathing, though barely. She looked at all 4 animals and was amazed to see that the little German Shepherd was actually trying to wag its tail weakly. Despite everything they had been through, it seemed to be trying to thank her. The animal shelter was only 10 minutes away now, and Claire had never been so relieved to see lights in the distance. As she pulled into the parking lot, several volunteers who had been working late rushed out into the rain, clearly surprised to see a police officer arriving at this hour with a crate full of animals. "Emergency situation," Claire called out as she carefully lifted the crate. "These puppies are in critical condition." Maria Torres, the shelter manager, immediately took charge, directing everyone toward the examination room. The volunteers moved with practiced efficiency, and within minutes, the 4 puppies were under bright lights, where their condition could be properly assessed. Dr. Ellen Park, the shelter's veterinarian who happened to be working late, quickly examined each animal. Her expression was grim as she checked vital signs and assessed their condition. "They're severely dehydrated and hypothermic," she announced to the room, "but they're alive, and that's what matters right now." She looked directly at Claire with obvious respect. "If you hadn't brought them tonight, I don't think any of them would have survived until morning." The next hour was a blur of activity as Dr. Park and the volunteers worked to stabilize the 4 puppies. Warm blankets, IV drips for the most critical ones, and careful feeding with specialized formula for animals in distress. Claire stayed right there beside the examination table, unwilling to leave until she knew they were going to be okay. The little German Shepherd that had led her to this moment never took its eyes off her, even as the medical team worked around it. There was something profound in that steady gaze, a connection that Claire had never experienced with another living being. As the night wore on, the puppies began to respond to treatment. Their breathing became steadier, their body temperature gradually returned to normal, and they even began to show interest in the food being offered to them. The 2 smallest ones remained weak, but they were stable. Dr. Park finally smiled and announced that all 4 would survive. "They're fighters," she said, gently stroking the German Shepherd's head. "Especially this little one. It's remarkable that a puppy this young would have the intelligence and courage to seek help for its siblings As the storm finally began to subside outside, the shelter team prepared a warm, comfortable pen for the 4 recovering puppies. Claire helped move them from the examination table, and she noticed how the little German Shepherd kept trying to position itself between her and the door, as if it was afraid she might leave without saying goodbye. Maria Torres, who had been watching the interaction with interest, smiled knowingly. "That little one has bonded with you," she observed. "It's not unusual after a rescue like this, but I've never seen anything quite this intense." Claire knelt down beside the pen and whispered softly to the puppy that had changed her entire evening. "I'll come back," she promised, though she had no idea at the time how prophetic those words would be. The German Shepherd tilted its head as if it understood exactly what she was saying, then settled down next to its siblings, finally allowing itself to rest. Claire walked out into the night air, emotionally and physically exhausted, but filled with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Claire woke up the next morning to bright sunlight streaming through the windows of her small apartment. For the first time in months, she had slept past her alarm, and her first conscious thought was of the 4 puppies at the shelter. She immediately called Maria Torres to check on their condition, and was relieved to learn that all of them had made it through the night successfully. They were eating well, more alert, and their vital signs were stable. "Would you like to visit before your shift?" Maria asked, and Claire found herself saying yes before she had even consciously decided. She quickly dressed and drove to the shelter, her heart racing with anticipation. Something had changed in her during those hours of crisis the night before, something fundamental and permanent. She had connected with those animals, especially the brave little German Shepherd, in a way that had awakened feelings she didn't even know she possessed. The thought of never seeing them again was surprisingly painful. Claire woke up the next morning to bright sunlight streaming through the windows of her small apartment. For the first time in months, she had slept past her alarm, and her first conscious thought was of the 4 puppies at the shelter. She immediately called Maria Torres to check on their condition, and was relieved to learn that all of them had made it through the night successfully. They were eating well, more alert, and their vital signs were stable. "Would you like to visit before your shift?" Maria asked, and Claire found herself saying yes before she had even consciously decided. She quickly dressed and drove to the shelter, her heart racing with anticipation. Something had changed in her during those hours of crisis the night before, something fundamental and permanent. She had connected with those animals, especially the brave little German Shepherd, in a way that had awakened feelings she didn't even know she possessed. The thought of never seeing them again was surprisingly painful. When Claire arrived at the shelter, the transformation in the puppies was remarkable. They were all more alert and active, their coats already beginning to look healthier after just one night of proper care. But it was the little German Shepherd's reaction that truly amazed her. The moment it saw her walking toward the pen, it bounded to the front, tail wagging furiously, making excited little barking sounds that seemed to express pure joy. Claire spent her entire lunch break sitting on the floor next to their enclosure, watching the puppies play and interact. She noticed how the 3 smaller ones looked to the German Shepherd for guidance, following its lead in everything from eating to exploring their new environment. It was clearly the leader of the group, the one who had taken responsibility for keeping them all alive. When she mentioned to Maria that she was thinking about adoption, the shelter manager's face lit up with understanding. "When the time comes," Maria said with a knowing smile, "I think you already know which one is meant to be yours." Over the following week, Claire found herself visiting the shelter every single day after her shifts. It became the highlight of her routine, and she began to realize how empty her life had been before these 4 little creatures had entered it. The puppies grew stronger and healthier each day, their personalities beginning to emerge more clearly. But her connection with the German Shepherd grew deeper with each visit. It would sit by the pen gate every day until she arrived, whining softly when she had to leave, and its eyes would follow her movements around the shelter with unwavering attention. The shelter staff began teasing her about being a perfect match, and Claire had to admit they were right. She had never considered herself a pet person before, but something about this particular animal spoke to her soul. It had risked everything to save its family, showing a level of courage and selflessness that reminded her of her own calling as a police officer. She began to seriously consider what her life might look like with a four-legged partner. The shelter announced that the puppies were finally ready for adoption, and Claire felt a mixture of joy and anxiety. She was thrilled that they were healthy enough to find permanent homes, but the thought of them being separated was bittersweet. Two of the smallest puppies were quickly adopted by loving families who had been waiting for the right pets. The third was scheduled to be picked up the next day by a young couple with children, but the little German Shepherd remained available, and Claire couldn't help but notice that several potential adopters had shown interest, but ultimately chosen other animals. It was almost as if the puppy was deliberately waiting for something, or someone, specific. That evening, Claire sat in her car in the shelter parking lot for almost an hour, just thinking about what she really wanted. She had already fallen in love with this brave little creature, and the idea of someone else taking it home was almost unbearable. The decision, when it finally came, felt inevitable and right. Claire spent the entire evening at her kitchen table, staring at the adoption paperwork that Maria had emailed to her. She read through every requirement, every responsibility, every commitment that would come with adopting a pet. But as she considered each point, she kept coming back to the image of that tiny puppy standing in the rain, refusing to give up until she had followed it to save its siblings. This wasn't just any animal. This was a hero in a small, furry package, a creature that had demonstrated the same values of courage and selflessness that had guided Claire's entire career. She thought about coming home each day to an empty apartment, and then she imagined coming home to a loyal companion who would be genuinely excited to see her. The loneliness she had been carrying for years suddenly seemed completely unnecessary. With a sense of certainty she hadn't felt in a long time, Claire signed the adoption papers, printed them out, and placed them beside her car keys. Tomorrow, she would bring her new partner home. The next morning, Claire arrived at the shelter with the completed adoption papers in hand and her heart full of nervous excitement. The moment she walked through the door, several staff members broke into smiles and applause. They had all been hoping she would make this decision, and they gathered around as she approached the pen where her new companion was waiting. The German Shepherd seemed to sense that something special was happening because it was more animated than she had ever seen it. When she knelt down and opened the pen door, the puppy jumped directly into her arms, licking her face enthusiastically and making sounds of pure happiness. "Looks like somebody approves," Maria said with tears in her eyes. Claire held the warm, squirming bundle of fur and felt something in her chest that she hadn't experienced in years, complete contentment. As they walked out to the car together, she realized she needed to give her new friend a proper name. "Scout," she said suddenly, trying it out. The puppy looked up at her and tilted its head, tail wagging. "Welcome to your new life, Scout." The first few weeks with Scout were an adventure and adjustment for both of them. Claire's small apartment suddenly felt much less empty, and she found herself looking forward to coming home each day in a way she never had before. Scout adapted to their new life with remarkable intelligence, quickly learning basic commands and house rules. But what impressed Claire most was the puppy's natural protective instincts. Scout was gentle and friendly with everyone they met, but there was always an alertness, a readiness to step in if anyone seemed threatened. Children especially seemed drawn to Scout, and the feeling was mutual. On their walks through the neighborhood, Claire watched with amazement as Scout would position itself between small children and the street, or gently guide a toddler away from a potentially dangerous situation. It was clear that this animal's heroic nature hadn't been a one-time occurrence. It was simply who Scout was at the core. Claire began taking Scout with her in the patrol car when regulations allowed, and her colleagues were impressed by how well-behaved and intuitive the young dog was. One evening, about a month after the adoption, Claire was sitting at her kitchen table writing her shift report, while Scout dozed contentedly at her feet. Rain had begun to fall outside, just like that first night when their paths had crossed, and the sound brought back a flood of memories. She looked down at her sleeping companion and marveled at the chain of events that had brought them together. If Scout hadn't been brave enough to venture out into that storm, hadn't been persistent enough to follow a police car for blocks, hadn't trusted a human enough to lead her to that abandoned farmhouse, 3 innocent lives would have been lost. But more than that, Claire realized she would have continued living her own life only half awake. going through the motions of existence without the deep sense of connection and purpose that Scout had brought into her world. "You know something, Scout?" she whispered to the sleeping animal. "I think you rescued me too." Scout's ears twitched slightly, and one eye opened to look at her with that same intelligent, soulful expression that had captivated her from the very beginning. Exactly 1 month later, Claire was on patrol when she spotted a medium-sized mixed-breed dog limping along the roadside. It was clearly injured and appeared to be lost or abandoned. Without hesitation, she pulled her patrol car over and got out. Scout, who now rode with her regularly, watched with interest from the passenger seat as Claire approached the stray animal with the same gentle, patient demeanor she had used that first night. The dog was wary, but allowed her to examine its injured paw and coax it toward the car. As she opened the back door, Scout moved aside to make room for their new passenger, actually nudging the injured animal gently, as if to say, "You're safe now." Claire looked at Scout with amazement and pride. Her companion had not only accepted this new rescue mission, but seemed to approve of it completely. As she started driving toward the animal shelter, with the rain beginning to fall once again, Claire realized that saving animals in distress was going to become a permanent part of their shared life. Scout had taught her that true heroism often comes in small packages, and that sometimes the greatest rescues happen when we open our hearts to creatures who need us most. If you enjoyed the story of Claire Bennett, I hand-picked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.